Good morning, everyone, and welcome back for our second set of panels for the day. So my name's Jeffrey Wilson. I'm the Director of Research and Economics at the Australian Industry Group. And we're the national peak body for businesses in traditional, emerging and innovative technology sectors. But today I'm also really pleased to be the chair of our panel, which is focused on economic security, shocks, preparedness and resilience. Now, I think for Australians, economic security has long been considered a problem that really afflicts other countries more so than our own. Australia's a resource-rich and advanced economy with really robust domestic institutions and strong international partnerships with all of the major growth centres in the Indo-Pacific. So by any measure, Australia has been one of the relatively most economically secure countries in the world for quite a long time. And when we often bring up the concept of economic security in policy debates, until quite recently, it's often been in terms of how Australia can contribute to the economic security of others through our aid, our trade, or our investment. And this means that the last few years, where we have seen a number of challenges and shocks to economic security, have been somewhat of a rude economic security awakening for the lucky country. We've had to grapple with all of the economic disruptions of the pandemic era, and come to realise the reality that Australia sits at the very far end of often overstretched global supply chains. We've had political challenges in many of our trade relationships, importantly including both China and the United States, that have made us reconsider the taken for granted quality of our trade investment flows. And we've just heard in the previous panel I was at this morning in the capability stream about how cybersecurity has continued to become an increasing problem for the Australian economy in the private sector, whether that's through emerging technologies, critical infrastructure, or our IT and software systems. So our panel this morning has two purposes. Firstly, to unpack the dynamics behind this sudden raft of economic security challenges that Australia finds itself confronting. And secondly, to consider what policy and institutional settings might be fit for purpose in this new world that we find ourselves. The National Security College has arranged a really extraordinary panel for us this morning of both broad and deep experience to help guide us through these questions. We have some, as you can see, we have some very esteemed names on the roster who all have extensive bios, as I mentioned in the program. I will name them for us now, however. We have Helen Mitchell, who's presently the Sir Roland Wilson Scholar in the Crawford School here at the ANU and an affiliate of the NSC. Chris Flynn, who's a partner at Gilbert and Tobin, specialising in energy and regulatory issues. Tania Constable, the Chief Executive Officer of the Minerals Council of Australia, the national peak body, and one of my institutional peers, the national peak body for the Australian resources sector. Darren Lim, who's a Senior Lecturer in the College of Arts and Social Sciences here at the ANU. And Swati Dave, who is presently the Chair of the Advisory Board of the Council of Australia-India Relations after a long career in a number of Australian financial sector roles. So this session we're going to run initially as an in-discussion plenary, and I'm going to collect a few comments, explanations, and provocations from our panel for the first roughly 45 minutes. I'm then going to open to questions from both the floor and from panellists to each other to further bring out some discussion before I'm under strict instructions to finish strictly at 25 minutes past midday today. And to start the discussion, I'd like to introduce Helen to really ask you, so Helen, your newest policy report, which is titled Unlocking Economic Security, a Strategic Playbook for Australia, was published by the United States Study Centre last month. In it, what you try and do is link together a wide variety of challenges for Australia under this common conceptual rubric of economic security, this process of how governments manage the flow of resources in and out of our country. And what you do in your reports, you lay out a playbook of options for how policymakers can grapple with the trade-offs involved often, and also argue for a much more joined up and, I guess, whole-of-nation approach to some of these issues. And as you've been promoting and taking the report around Canberra over the last few weeks, I wanted to know what elements have the policymaker community been most surprised, enlightened, maybe even shocked by?
Thanks, Jeff, and great to see everybody here for this panel. We're up against some stiff competition, so you've made the smart choice choosing your economic security. I can confidently, Jeff, you called it my latest public policy report. I can confidently say it's the best one yet, being the only one that I have out there in the sphere, because I'm actually an Australian government official that's currently lucky enough to be doing some work here at the ANU, at the National Security College, on economic security. Previously, my history has been with foreign affairs and trade, Treasury, and the Prime Minister's portfolio. So about this report, really what I'm trying to do in this report is take my academic research on economic security and statecraft and make it applicable to the sort of issues that we're facing right now in terms of economic security. But the underlying focus of the report is actually thinking about positioning us for what's coming down the pipeline. So it is academic work, so I do get a bit into what is economic security, but that's with a real focus for policymakers on a practical definition that helps the policy community, and then by extension, who the policy community has to work with businesses, other countries, community groups, to actually progress that economic security agenda and make sure that we're balancing the economic side of economic security with the security side. So I talk about in the report this idea of flows of resources between countries, so goods and services and people. But these days, because of advances in technology, it's also information, ideas, financial networks. So the reason to actually put a definition around economic security is that once you see that as the big umbrella of what falls under economic security, you then have to think about quite a few more groups, and definitely the deep and vast economic networks that make up the global economy when you pair that with the geopolitics of economic security. So if you do that, what you actually get to is what's the state's role in balancing and managing the risks, but also the opportunities of these global flows of resources. And that's really where you can get into this idea of thinking about what are the economic benefits of economic connections, these resource flows between countries, as well as what are some of the risks. I illustrate the kinds of tools then that policymakers can think about when they're thinking about economic security. So they're the sort of tools that you can use to actually forge and expand those connections, things like free trade agreements or aid or scholarships. But on the flip side, and what gets a lot of attention at the moment, and rightly so, is also the kind of tools you can use to sever or try and reduce those economic connections. So this is things like sanctions, for example, or travel bans. So really, I wrote the report because I could see that all of these tools and issues were coming up time and time again in different parts of government. And what I could see was that if you link the thread of all these issues and think about what's coming up now and down the pipeline, what you really need to do is join up that policy conversation and see all of those tools and policies as different levers that the government can calibrate as part of its broader, strategic agenda, but also prosperity agenda, which feeds back into strategic security. So some of the examples, that Jeff was alluding to, and I can touch on, of course, are things like China's bans on our exports or worries about supply chains in times of crisis. The pandemic illustrated that for us. But also things like aid and new commercial ventures in the Pacific. That falls under the same rubric of economic security as well, in my view. Basically, where I get to in the report is that joining up some of these nodes that deal on these issues across government will help us have more holistic conversations about economic security. So by balancing both the economic and security parts of these issues, you can avoid things like rent seeking, that curbs innovation ultimately for Australia and reduces our strategic capabilities. But you can also join up those conversations about security risks of economic connections and think about ways to prepare for them in the future. Finally, what I get to in the report is I suggest the need for a data capability. So data and analysis of economic security policies. And I argue in the report that you need a really sector-specific approach to make sure that you're not just kind of having a blanket security approach to every type of economic connection. It really depends on what sort of market you're talking about. For example, there were bans placed by China on Australian exports that didn't touch some very important resource sectors for China. So had you taken a particular export economic security approach to things like agricultural exports from Australia, you'd end up with a very different sector-specific approach than you would, for example, in iron ore exports, which are highly valued by China. All right, so to actually get back to your question, Jeff, so really quickly, the parts of the report that have been surprising or useful, depending on who you're talking to, well, officials that are, Australia, Japan, NATO policymakers, South Korea, They found the report useful for thinking about managing the tensions between their strategic interests in their relationship with the United States and tensions on the economic security side. For anyone that was here for the panel that just immediately preceded us, this came up as an issue. This is the idea that, you might have a strategic or even just a close partnership on strategic issues with the US, but your economic security interests may not neatly overlap onto those of the US, and sometimes they could even be directly opposing. So in the report, I think what high-level officials in those countries or groups have found useful is that I've pointed out that these tensions are not going away. So not only do they exist now, but they're likely to be more in the future. And that's where both having this joined up economic security approach is useful to seeing what those sort of issues are coming down the pipeline, but also having this data and analysis capability to help governments predict where that might be coming up and where the national interest is going to lie. The other, that sort of structure gives us flexibility, which we need as the global environment gets more competitive, and it'll also help ensure that balanced economic security decisions are being made. For researchers, there's been different sort of aspects of the report that have been surprising and interesting. So for researchers, I've noticed some interest in the way that I define these economic security issues according to the economic logic of how they work. So a lot of the time, these issues previously have sort of sat either quite squarely with economists looking at quite narrow topics on things like sanctions, or this work has sat in the sort of strategic studies and political science arena that overlooked the economic logic of how these tools work. And, frankly, that was fine sort of 30, 40, 50 years ago when economic connections between countries were quite simple. Sometimes they were just pure sort of simple bilateral relationships. But you can't do that now because now, you look at things like semiconductor supply chains or other complex global networks, and you also need to understand how those markets work and those characteristics to figure out how those tools are actually going to play out. And then finally, Jeff, you didn't actually ask me, but for me, what's been surprising and enlightening as doing this economic security research has actually been discovering some of the powerful tools that get overlooked in these discussions. So in my research, for example, I've noticed that tools that can get overlooked because they're not particularly expensive, they're not particularly sort of sexy in a strategic way, but they can be really powerful and enduring. And those sort of tools are things like scholarships, trade agreements, even labour market policies, so things like migration programs. In other parts of the world as well as our own, these have actually been very powerful tools for achieving foreign policy objectives. So for me, that's been the sort of the enlightening part of the research work.
Excellent. Look, thanks very much, Helen. That's a really interesting start. And look, Chris, I'd like to turn to you now and pick up on something, critical infrastructure, which I think is probably one of the most meaty examples of some of those dynamics Helen was just introducing us to. So, critical infrastructure is really where the rubber hits the road on economic security. You've got some of the most sensitive, complex, from a Canberra perspective, whole of government, multi-agency kind of problems that need to be dealt with. But they're manifesting in one of the areas that, from a commercial perspective, are some of the largest, most financially and operationally complex commercial projects that exist anywhere in any economy, certainly Australia's. And we've certainly seen there's been a lot of changes. It's been a moving feast with regulations such as ASOCI legislation, and everyone's read in the newspaper about some of the most controversial cases down the few years, and we should expect there's going to be more in the future. So where you've come from in this is in corporate law, working on all these projects. What is it that Australian policymakers kind of need in the playbook, as Helen puts it, that we don't quite have to grapple with that creative tension?
Okay. Can people hear me now? Or? Right, great. Okay, thank you. It's a very, very good question. There are two ways of thinking about it. Obviously, there's been a lot of change over the last several years around critical infrastructure and the way we think about critical infrastructure. Indeed, just the awareness that it exists in the community and in the business community and in the Australian community more generally, I think. That's the first thing. The second thing is there's been a great deal of work done in Canberra, in government, and also within business to ensure that it's as secure as it possibly can be in Australia. That's the first part of critical infrastructure, which is thinking about where our vulnerabilities are, where our choke points are, what we really need to continue functioning, to keep economic security in place. Obviously, the economy is fundamentally the thing that underwrites our ability to defend ourselves. So in effect, it is as simple as that. Critical infrastructure underwrites defence, underwrites energy security, and energy security underwrites just about everything ultimately, right? We'll get to that in a moment. But also, I think Australia is becoming increasingly aware not only of the reality that its critical infrastructure needs protecting and an idea of what it is and how to go about doing that, but also that there may be infrastructure which is critical to our own security, which is actually physically not in Australia. And I'll get to that in a moment as well. On the first piece, the challenge has been this: the way I describe it to my clients, either foreign clients or Australian clients, is that it's about this. It's about pacification of capital and repatriation of control. As Richard Maud said earlier today, Australia is a capital importer. Nothing is going to change that. We're a capital importer. We have a large need, an ongoing need for foreign capital in order to maintain the type of living standard, the living standards and the type of economy we wish to maintain. We do that predominantly through market forces. Repatriation of control. Now, that means making sure that there is an acceptable level of domestic control, either day to day or in an emergency here in Australia. That's a much more difficult thing to do, because if you're a foreign investor and you're investing in critical infrastructure in Australia, you expect a minimum level of control to go with your capital. Control and capital in any investment, in anything, go together, whether it's a bilateral investment treaty, actually, or whether it's a simple contract to buy or lease a piece of real estate. It is the most fundamental concept in negotiation in these sorts of investments. So pacification of capital, repatriation of control. What the government has done to date is, through the SOCI legislation, through applying through FIRB conditions, levels of control and transparency that it would have a more difficult time getting through Parliament, or which it would rather not use the blunt force of legislation to achieve. But we're kind of getting beyond that. We need to have a more nuanced approach, and that involves a clearer articulation of what Australia's national security objectives are, and a better conversation and a more organic relationship between Canberra, Sydney and Melbourne and Perth. In particular, also Brisbane, Adelaide and Darwin as well. But where we're seeing I'll explain to you why I say those three communities in particular. Foreign investment comes through Sydney. Sponsors of capital are in Melbourne, except to the extent they are in Perth because they're in the resources industry, right? And so, in my practice spans all of that. So there's a very, very, very important level of I call it emulated fusion, which we need to get between business and government in Australia, which our strategic rival achieves either through the force of central coercion within its own legal system, or simply because of the system that it has. That's the first thing. The second thing is the idea that our critical infrastructure might actually not only reside in Australia, that we have infrastructure that is critical to our security, that is located in our near approaches or even further afield. And how we go about playing a part, either ourselves or with other countries, to ensure that that is secure and that our interests are properly reflected in the way that those things are structured. A very, very good example of that type of arrangement might be the Digicel Telstra arrangement in the Pacific. Obviously, not infrastructure which was entirely located here in Australia, but which no doubt, I don't think anyone in this room would disagree, would be, in inverted commas, critical infrastructure for the purposes of Australian national security. That's a good example. And what that involved was exactly the type of dialogue, although in a very early, maybe even a primitive way, between business on one hand and government on the other through a national champion, which we'll see more of as well, to achieve a more secure outcome in infrastructure for Australia. And my opinion is, having acted for many countries, we've been getting it wrong. That's not an example of getting it wrong, but we've been getting it wrong. And we need to be more joined up, more fluid, more nuanced, less reactive, and more forward thinking about the way we engage with those countries, in particular on our near approaches, about how we achieve these objectives with respect to their infrastructure that is also our critical infrastructure, if that makes sense.
Look, thanks very much, Chris. I could also say thank you for mentioning Perth, my adoptive hometown, on the list of centres of finance capital in Australia. I'll be glad to go home and say that in the terrace. Absolutely. I heard it from this guy. But look, I'd like to bring Swati into the conversation now and move from critical infrastructure, which really is a perennial economic security issue for Australia, to something trade and trade diversification, which is a more new in the way that we've been talking about this. So I think for a long time, Australia's not really considered, trades had a taken for granted quality in Australia. It's not been considered a high profile economic security issue like this. But we have had quite a shock over some of the trade disruptions over the last couple of years since the pandemic. Some of those were natural things, some of the supply chain interruptions that we saw during the pandemic. And we've also had some that were more political in character, particularly trade disputes with China. I think it would be fair to say that there has been a bit of a national consensus that trade diversification, which involves both trading with a wider range of partners, but also a wider range of goods, because those things come together, has a value as an insurance policy in a period of trade disruption. But trade diversification can also be harder for the commercial sector to be able to implement than it is necessarily for a policymaker in Canberra to say, wouldn't that be helpful for our national resilience? And Swati, you've been deeply involved in these debates in Australia in a couple of your past roles. So could you give us a bit of an explanation of how that has been working through the way commercial and policy Australia is thinking about trade?
Thank you, Jeffrey. So, the developments that you spoke about are very much what have really focused people's attention on diversification in a more practical way. I don't know if people...
Yeah, my apologies, AV. Could we have Swati's microphone on?
Hello?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. So what I was saying, Jeffrey, is just the recent developments that you highlighted really bring home this whole need for trade diversification, both in terms of, the countries that we trade with and also what we trade in. And, I just need to reflect on, the fact that our two-way trade is concentrated with 4 countries, being China, Japan, US, and South Korea. And that 50% of our exports are concentrated on coal, iron ore, and natural gas. And, whilst that's worked very well for us for a very long time, it's not an ideal position to be in. And as you rightly point out, trade diversification is very challenging. It's easy to talk about in terms of theoretically and from a policy point of view, but it's really hard for businesses to be involved in that process. It requires businesses to invest time and money in understanding new markets that have new risks and much more complex risks. So when you're looking at new markets, you've got to look at, well, what's the political environment? What's the legal and regulatory environment? If I go in, can I and invest, will I get my money out? Will I get paid? All these issues that, have been well worked out for the countries that we're already trading very effectively with need to be worked out for the new countries that we want to do that with. And that takes time. And the reality is, businesses, we have to test whether businesses have the time, the capacity, and the capability to do that. And also whether they have the risk appetite. And that risk appetite will depend very much on what kind of business it is. So if you're a large corporate, does your board have that risk appetite for you? Do your shareholders think it's a good idea for you to do it? I find SMEs are a lot more entrepreneurial and will just go and do it because they can make those decisions and they bear the consequences. So businesses need to do a lot of work, but governments also need to do quite a bit of work, which is around negotiating free trade agreements, providing the policy settings that will help organizations and will also What other support can they provide businesses as they're venturing into new markets? And it's not always financial support. It is also things like, can they facilitate introductions? Can they facilitate better information sharing and provide greater knowledge to help businesses deal with the high complexity of risks of those markets? And, I'm going to put in a plug for my previous organisation. So organisations like Export Finance Australia are ideal to help businesses do that, because they do have a unique insight into these new markets, because they're dealing with them on a regular basis. They're engaging with DFAT Post, they're engaging with other export credit agencies and other multilateral financing organisations around the world. So I think businesses need to be more proactive in using those organisations. Now let's look at trade diversification through an initiative, I guess, that I'm involved in, which is the Centre for Australia-India Relations. And that, I guess, the creation of the centre came about because of the need for diversification and the recognition that we needed to have a much deeper and broader economic relationship with India. And it kind of comes together because, India is a very large market with 1.4 billion people. And the signing of the Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement in 2022 really was a pivotal moment in that relationship. But as with most countries that you want to work with, India is being courted by all the major economies around the world. And we need to move really fast if we want to realize the potential in that relationship. So since the launch last May, the Centre for Australia-India Relations has been working very hard to build greater awareness of the opportunities and the risks in contemporary India and to facilitate new models of cooperation. There are some really outdated views of what India is, right? People still think about, we'll get cheap labor in India and, we're going to use them for technology, back office. But these are all really outdated notions. So we've had to work very hard to give people a contemporary India perspective. The creation of the centre is not to say there's nothing going on. The India ecosystem in Australia is very large and complex, and there are many organisations who are working very hard across it. The centre's really been created to help bring all of that together and to make sure we're focusing on leveraging our diaspora, really deepening cultural connections, making sure there's informed policy dialogue and informed public discussion around what's happening in both countries, because that's really important to lift understanding, and also to make sure that businesses know what's going on and have the information, the connections, and the understanding to really leverage the opportunity. So they're the kinds of interventions that are needed for trade diversification. Now, Tania, you and I were at the CEO Forum with Prime Minister Albanese, and in the discussions around those roundtables, a lot of focus was on things like decarbonisation, critical minerals, net zero, all of these themes that are very common for people around the world. So again, the dialogue is a very different dialogue, and the types of sectors and industries that we want to engage in have moved to a different level. So one of the things, I guess, do I have time? A quick one. We're seeing this play out also in the Southeast Asia economic strategy. So Australia is very underdone in that space as well. So a lot of the recommendations that are coming out of that, I think, build upon what was done with the India work. And I know through that process, there is a lot more focus on, raising awareness, removing barriers, removing blockages, facilitating investment through Export Finance Australia. All of these things that, we've kind of learned over time, and Australia is kind of using to develop this whole diversification agenda. The last point I want to make is around the whole financing perspective, because that actually is where it gets more complicated. So for businesses to think about going into different markets, if they're an equity investor, they want to make sure that the investment results in a good upside. They want to make sure that that their shareholders are going to be comfortable with the decisions they're making. If you're going into it as a debt provider, you want to make sure that you're going to be repaid. And, some of the issues that we grapple with in the financing services industry, like anti-money laundering, know your customer, bribery, corruption, all of these things are being properly managed because the consequences of not doing that are very high. So that also adds to a level of complexity when businesses want to think of diversification because they have to resolve all those issues.
Oh, thanks very much, Swati. That was a really interesting introduction to what it looks like to do some country diversification, with India as one example, and as you mentioned, with Southeast Asia, it's only one. I was hoping to turn to Tania now and talk about maybe more the industrial or sectoral aspect of diversification of resources. And at risk of sounding like a West Australian here, the resource sector is a massive boon and an underappreciated source of national economic security for Australia. On the domestic front, there's the economic contribution, whether that's employment, exports, industrial capability, tax base, the sector brings. But it's also often a foundation for some of our international relationships. And if you go back through history, it's a foundation for the Australia-Japan trade relationship on which a lot more things were subsequently built. Korea, China, potentially in some areas India at the moment as well. But there has been some difficulties. The people in the industry here will have read that there's been some challenges for the Australian resource sector over the last couple of months this year, particularly in some of, I guess, what we might call those diversification industries, lithium and nickel as well, that have had a particular challenging time. So I was hoping you could give us a perspective on where the industry is sitting at the moment and kind of how it fits into these dynamics that Swati's just introduced at the country level. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jeff. If I think about this room and the infrastructure in this room, pretty much everything here is mined, with the exception of the plants behind, which are grown. So the two themes, you either mine it or you grow it. And that makes the mining industry pretty critical to modern day life. It makes it critical, picking up on Swati's theme around trade, our economic growth, our economic resilience, our national security. It is so integral to that. So where do we sit at the moment? In 2022-23, in terms of our financial economic outlook, the mining industry was about 10% of GDP, so critical. It was 66% of our overall exports. 1.1 million people are employed in supply chains. So that's not just direct employment within the mining industry, but if you look downstream at the mining, the engineering, tech, services sector in the supply chains, it's 1.1 million people. So around about 10% of those that are employed sit within the supply chain. So once again, really very critical to the industry. So we're doing very well as an economy, very well in our mining industry. And largely that's been off the back of also the luck that has been created primarily because of some of the challenging economic and political issues that we're seeing elsewhere in the world. Now, there have been other jurisdictions that have faced some safety issues. If I look at what's occurred in South America around iron ore, for instance. Iron ore, Brazil was doing very well in iron ore. Vale was contributing a lot of what was needed at a global level to match what Australia has been producing in Western Australia. But it only takes a challenging safety issue for some of that supply to be removed from the market. And Australia has benefited, unfortunately, for other jurisdictions, but has benefited during that phase. So prices remain quite high for iron ore. We've seen a war in Europe that has been sustained over a period of time in between Russia and the Ukraine. That's holding up prices as it relates to some of the other energy sources, such as coal and gas. So they are, while problematic at a global level, Australia is certainly benefiting and will continue to benefit for a period of time because the capital stock that is required to replace some of these is so significant. Within Australia, we're talking, we're talking $20 billion a year to replace some of the capital stock that we're seeing that is needed around the world. Now, that's not going to be replaced anytime soon. That will hold up global prices. It will hold up Australian prices, and everyone benefits in Australia, not least of all from a revenue perspective. So we have the resources that are going to be required to achieve the next growth phase in Australia and around the world. We have plenty of the energy resources, the coal, the iron ore, the gas that is required in the short to the medium term. We have critical minerals that are going to be required to get to net zero. But we have seen vulnerabilities, as Jeff mentioned, in the market over the last few months. And that's largely because there has been a movement of Indonesia partnering with China to bring low-cost nickel into the market. Now, that means that they have gone from a medium supplier to the largest supplier at a global level in a very, very short time frame. And we don't expect that will change over the medium term. Perhaps the next 2 years to 5 years, they will hold their position. And in fact, will grow their position. And that produces another vulnerability in pushing other markets or other supply out of the market. Australia will be affected. Now, we shouldn't think that just applies to nickel. We have other vulnerabilities that are needed in critical minerals around cobalt. It could be problematic. Copper could be problematic. Lithium could be problematic. There are a number of critical minerals that we're seeing that could, in fact, place pressure on what we're seeing as the growth that we have come to appreciate over a period of time in Australia. So that's going to be challenged over the near term, over the medium term. So Australia has to address where we can some of those vulnerabilities. So we can't match low price because we have other issues. We have rising costs. Our labour costs in mining are very high. If I look at nickel, 30 to 40% of the costs overall relate to labour. We have declining productivity across the economy, and that while productivity has been very high in the mining sector, in fact, the highest in Australia, we are facing productivity challenges as we speak. We've seen stagnant investment. There are pockets, but overall stagnant investment across Australia and within the mining sector. And we've got, as I said, increased policy challenges as we've been moving through. So I'm sure you will have seen me in the media talking about industrial relations, taxation, the safeguard mechanism. We absolutely fully support, but incrementally it's placing pressure on some of those costs associated with the industry. And environmental planning is also a major problem. We have to address that specific issue and bring our planning processes and the timeframes right down from what are significant periods, 16 years. We need to halve those in Australia so we remain competitive with other parts of the world. We can get to other issues a little bit later, but I will say, just matching what Swati has said around trade, our trade relationships have been extremely important. Mining has sat at the centre of those relationships, but strategic partnerships is where it really is at for us. The trade relationships, the free trade agreements are important. We've had major gains in some of those areas over the last couple of years, but importantly, strategic partnerships, particularly in this region, are going to be critical for us in terms of taking that next step, remaining competitive, and addressing, importantly, our national economic resilience and our national security.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Tania. Now, just to echo one of your points from an Australian industry group point of view regarding productivity, it might not be well known to a kind of national security college audience, but in the last financial year, Australia's productivity measured by labour productivity fell by 2.8%. And this is the first time in the keeping of the modern statistics for nearly 40 years, we've never had this happen before. And I think there's some serious national security implications about a country that for the first time in 4 decades is having productivity not just growing poorly, but going backwards. What does that mean for developing the capabilities that we're identifying at a conference like this is important? And this leads me to Darren. So the last one of our panel, and we've had a really nice tension emerge here between Swati's comments around diversification and Tania's regarding decarbonisation, really, which is what we're talking about with net zero. And this has been a really interesting example of where some of the competing imperatives regarding economic security come to the fore. There's a really hot debate going on at the moment between some industrial policy advocates as to whether the best route to take is target climate, target net zero as fast as possible, do that with open market settings. And that means you buy the EVs and the solar panels and the hydrogen electrolyzers and all of that stuff from global supply chains from whoever's the cheapest. On the other hand, and you see this as a different industrial policy voice saying taking that effectively laissez-faire approach to the energy transition is going to mean most of that's going to come from China on present industrial settings. And if it comes from China, there's a big economic security and a lack of diversification. Like, do we then mortgage the energy transition to Chinese industrial monopolies? So I was interested as to, Darren's been very passionate on this diversification decarb trade-off, but I'd be interested in how, like, this is where the rub hits the road for this stuff, right? Like, how do you think we can navigate this in Australia?
So to begin, you have to put that debate of decarbonisation and de-risking in context, which is to understand where we came from with the post-war economic order. Like the Bretton Woods institutions and the GATT WTO system formulated in the 1940s in response to what happened in World War II, with 2 motivating principles. One, free trade is good. Since Adam Smith, we've been told it's the foundation of the wealth of nations, and that's correct. But 2, the beggar thy neighbour protectionism of the 1930s was seen very much as a cause of World War II. So protectionism and closure are national security threats because they can lead to the most horrible of outcomes. So we have an economic order in the post-war period that prioritises free trade because free trade is good and helps promote peace, but also recognises that there does need to be some flexibility for governments to pursue other social purposes. Think of the 1940s as coming out of the New Deal in the United States, and the importance of a welfare state, right? Following the new empowerment through voting and enfranchisement of the working classes, they need to be protected. And so free trade can go too far sometimes and lose its social legitimacy. And so there needs to be some protections built into the rules and built into our understanding of those rules to manage those. The problem we have now is that there are new concerns, national interests, you might say, that are rubbing up against that system. And let's focus on 2. The first, the national security concern, which is that there are unacceptable choke points that have emerged due to the fragmentation of global supply chains that sit with our adversaries. And the US thinks this, we think this, China thinks this, right? That we don't want to critical goods that can be used to be weaponized against us. We've seen how this works in the sanctions context with Russia. Australia has experiences, of course, with China. And so we need to de-risk these supply chains. And that might require us to ignore some of the principles of free trade to do so. The other one, as you mentioned, Jeff, is decarbonisation. You can think of pollution control as the classic negative externality, right? An activity that arises out of economic activity that isn't priced in by the actors. And governments need to step in and pass laws to stop companies and individuals from polluting, whether it's cigarette smoke or effluent into a river. It's also kind of a market failure, right? Not accounted for by free markets, by free trade, and there is a role for governments to step in. And so now the decarbonisation debate is also saying, well, climate change is an emergency, and so governments have to play a big role to support markets and to augment markets to make sure that we are rapidly, getting that technology operational as soon as possible. But of course, when governments get involved, again, you are stepping away from the principles of free trade, right? It's inevitability. It has got a long intellectual lineage going back to Alexander Hamilton and Frederick List from the 19th century, that governments do need to protect infant industry sometimes from global competition. But now it has that modern take of the climate change emergency. So both the de-risking and the decarbonisation imperatives clash with the basic idea that free trade is good embedded in the existing international economic order. But they also, as you say, Jeff, clash with each other. And so we have these double or dual tensions. And we have to keep in mind that there is always going to be an incentive, to protect national security or to, promote the energy transition. But lying behind us has to be the memory of, the 1930s was very bad. And we don't want to create a universe where we salami slice away the principles of free trade for these laudable objectives, but end up in a world that looks like the 1930s, right? So we have to balance three different equities here. We want to keep the order, we want to embed principles of free trade as much as possible, we want to protect our national security, and we want to decarbonise. So how do you do that? It's a huge job. And let me just sort of put out two sort of principles that are guiding my thinking about this. The first is we need new rules. We need black and white written in black letters in treaties or somewhere that look to bound these exceptions. And we've done this before. In the post-war economic agreements, there were exceptions, for example, to manage the balance of payments that were written into treaties that allowed states, governments, to depart from free trade principles where it was deemed important to do so. But in the national security space right now, you've got Article 21 or 22 of the GATT, which sort of carves out a broad national security exception. But there's very little, litigation on this, no case law, let alone any more details about what it means to face a legitimate national security concern. Jake Sullivan said at the Brookings Institution last year, we just don't want our technology to be used against us on the battlefield, right? And that sounds fair enough, but that is, a statement that has no detail to it. And I'm sure you can all imagine you put a different person in the decision-making spot and they might define national security very differently. For example, Donald Trump and the Trump administration imposed widespread tariffs on aluminium and steel in, I think, about 2018. And one country that got caught up in that, not Australia, because we were able to wiggle our way out of them, but our friends across the Tasman, New Zealand, right? New Zealand was technically coded as a national security threat by the United States to justify the imposition of steel and aluminium tariffs, which is, of course, absurd, right? So if you don't write rules, if you don't put some kind of boundaries to this, then people are going to be able to import whatever motivations they like, right? Or whatever, understandings of the world they like into these. Now, of course, you might respond by saying, how are we going to get agreement among 150, 200 countries on what the rules should be? That is a problem, right? That explains the paralysis in the WTO right now. But we have to start somewhere. And so smart lawyers and economists working together, maybe with some political scientists as well, need to start trying to bound these things, right, in some sense. The same applies in the climate change space, right? People criticise the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, billed as the largest piece of climate change legislation in the history of humankind, but also kind of protectionist. Do we need to have a world where such aggressive but important climate change legislation is actually consistent with the rules-based economic order? We probably do. But again, that requires us to draft some rules to bound that exception. The second principle is when you're making choices to try to err on the side of opening markets rather than closing them at the margins. Now, that's not always going to be possible, but this sort of is where it becomes relevant for a country like Australia, we don't have a large green tech industry. We operate at one end of the supply chain, and the moves you're seeing from the government working with industry have been largely to bring new supplies online, right? And new processing plants and mining for rare earths, for example, and partnering with our security partners, in where we want to sell those things. And those are the kind of things you want to encourage as long as you are expanding the size of the market. The government can step in and use taxpayer funding to promote these kinds of industries which have a climate change and a national security imperative. But we want to be very careful if we want to, the temptation might be there to limit who we sell our things to impose conditions that effectively become protectionism. Again, they might become justified case by case, but as a starting principle, applied both to climate change and to national security, we want to see the bigger picture and err on the side of expanding rather than contracting markets. I'll stop there.
Oh, thanks very much, Darren, for that. Now, I've got more questions for the panel, but in interest of time, and I did a rough count, there's about 100 people here in the room, so I'd like to take this opportunity to open it up to the floor and the audience. We've had some really a diverse set of presentations, but also some deep things, and I think there's already a lot of meat on the bone for this topic. Now, just before I go to the floor, I'll take a couple of questions at once so we can group them up and pose them to the panel and bring everybody in. Just a couple of ground rules. One, can you please identify yourself and your organisation when you start your question? 2, can your question please be short? And 3, can your question please be a question posed to the panel? You may pose to one or all. Sorry, I've got stage lights in my eye. I'll start with this lady here and then maybe also the one in the grey just here as well, just to take 2 to start off. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Pernille Cartel, I'm the Danish ambassador, and therefore, of course, I'm also European. Several of you have mentioned free trade agreements. And I wanted to ask you, for everybody in the panel really, a free trade agreement between Australia and Europe, from an economic security perspective, how does that play in?
This lady, sorry, apologies, maybe a teal jacket here as well. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Is it on? Yes.
Yeah, that one.
I'd like to bump this conversation. Oh, sorry, Christy Cooper, I'm a student at ANU. I'd like to bump the conversation into a different register, if I might. How would you respectively define economic warfare? And have you found any Australian instances of indulging in it? Or is Australia quite squeamish about economic warfare as a security feature?
Sorry, ma'am, could you just, the second half of that question, could you say it just a little bit more louder so we could hear it down here on the stage? Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, cheers.
Have you found instances of Australia indulging in economic warfare, or is Australia quite squeamish about it as a security feature, just in a different register of the general conversation?
Certainly. Any other hands? Just I might take a third. Front row. Sorry, with the microphone, just gentleman in the front row, grey shirt. Thanks.
Hi, thanks very much, guys. It goes across all your conversations about diversification. We've seen the Australian government pursue multiple different potential angles of trade diversification, from India to Southeast Asia to now they're building solar panels, a huge wide variety. In your eyes, what is one way that you would like to see the government putting its effort into diversifying and sort of solidifying Australia's economic security?
Thanks, sir. Could you just name the affiliation? Thanks.
My name's Ben Westcott. I'm from Bloomberg.
Bloomberg, no, I was saying. So Ben from Bloomberg, right? Yeah, okay. A couple of questions there. Ben, I might save yours as a nice one. We can go around the whole group as if you had one, if you had one wish, what would it be in this area? But to first pick up the question regarding free trade agreement and European FTA, this is something, Tania, I might like to bring you on this and Swati as well if I could, because, this economic security and diversification have been themes that were part of the discussions around the Australia-EU FTA. They were part of the discussions around the Australia-India's first trade agreement of a few years ago, and maybe another one that's in the works too. So, would you be able to share some of your thoughts respectively on those? Yeah.
Sure. I think we've made great gains on free trade agreements, as I said, over a long period of time, and Swati and I are in agreement over that. And it was good to see the UK trade agreement finalised. But, of course, there's been difficulties with the EU trade agreement, specifically around agriculture. And there's a degree of protectionism that sits with different countries within the European Union around that specific issue. And I know that the Trade Minister, Australia, has gone back and said, well, what would it take to actually complete this trade agreement? And I think that that's very difficult, and countries around the world have experienced that. But I do think that there's another way, and that is through the strategic partnerships. We don't necessarily just have to have an FTA. We can use our strategic partnerships, and Europe, we heard this morning, is very important in terms of that economic security, that diversification. And I believe that we've got to start that conversation with some specific areas. It could be critical minerals. Take a few of the issues that sit in a trade agreement, set the FTA aside, and just focus on what is achievable with partners like the European Union, with some of the countries within the Asian region. ASEAN is critical to that. Of course, the United States. And I do think that the IRA presents us an enormous opportunity. It's not. It's about how we go about that. So just to answer your question on the European Union, I think there is another way because we're not going to do it through an FTA. Let's focus on a strategic partnership and try and pick off some issues that we agree on.
Thanks. So you may need to borrow Darren's microphone. A number of... You okay? Oh, it is work fine. A number of these issues were also at stake in the FTA with India a few years ago, and Australia was one of the first countries to get one of these, which functions as a positional good, and we have been the first to market on a number of them in competition with NZ over the last decade. How's this play out in that context, and what does that trade agreement mean for the nature of the Australia-India trade relationship? Like what does it add that we didn't have without it?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I won't speak specifically on the question, but if we think about, can you hear? Yep. Can everybody hear me?
Perfect, yeah.
That trade agreement was very momentous, as I mentioned previously, because it was the first one that India had concluded in a very long time. And whilst, we were all very excited when it happened, it took over 10 years to get to that point. But why, what is it in that agreement that's been of benefit, and why is it delivering? I think it is around, it suddenly paved the way for people to engage more meaningfully from an economic point of view. And a lot of, the removal of tariffs on, pretty much most of the products, I think that really opened the doors. And when we were doing consultations with SMEs post that agreement being concluded, there was a lot more, I guess, sense of energy and empowerment within Australia to engage with India. So I think all of these things, there's the symbolic piece, but there's also the substantive piece around, what have been the pain points in the engagement, and have they been picked up in those trade agreements? Now, it won't pick up everything, but it was a huge move towards it. And of course, it's a precursor to a bigger agreement. But this in itself is substantive. So it's not necessarily that it feels interim. It's quite substantial and substantive. And since it was concluded, I think there's something like 35% increase in industrial exports and maybe 60% in agricultural exports. So it makes a difference.
Thanks very much. Now, to pose to the next question around economic warfare, which I guess takes this one a bit more, I'd probably go to Chris and Helen both. Question is cheekily asked, are Australians squeamish about this economic warfare? Some of the behaviour we've seen from Trump, some of it that certain countries in the region have directed at us. That comes through trade. It also comes through critical infrastructure and energy markets as well. So just both your takes on that, like being at the forefront of, in both your careers, dealing with Australians having to respond to these kind of things. When it happens to us, how do we feel?
That's an interesting question. But so the questioner did ask about sort of what is economic warfare. So I think one thing we have to perhaps say at the outset is I think often when people say economic warfare, they're talking about sort of strategically manipulating their, whether it's their supply relationships with other countries, that could be goods or it could be services, it could be things like financial sanctions, right? I think that kind of sits in the realm of sort of economic warfare. So the Australian take on that, I think first of all, you have to look at our endowments. What does our economy look like? We're probably not in the position to do a lot of economic warfare, right? We do depend both for economic but also for strategic reasons on having a flexible, open economy. The other thing, I guess, is what are the sort of effects we would be looking for by using economic warfare if Australia was to consider, doing that? In the session before this one, we were talking about deterrence and diplomacy, right? So there were scenarios raised in which you could think about Australia taking an all arms of statecraft approach and thinking about our economic levers in, for example, a regional crisis, and thinking about how we would use our economic relationships in that situation. So for me, that's really the only sort of area where I would say we can talk about Australian economic warfare seriously as being a possibility. I focus in my work on thinking more about, the benefits that Australia's economy brings to the region and how we can actually think about sort of positive, and open economic relationships, and how that actually adds to sort of deterrence as well as to our capabilities, which is not economic warfare playing out, but it's about, avoiding things like economic warfare and actually setting the conditions before you get to that situation, right? So it's not completely avoiding the question, but it's thinking about how we can become indispensable to our region, through lots of countries in the Indo-Pacific are starting to think about their clean energy transitions. They're always worried about food security. So these are areas where Australia can continue our current energy relationships, and we might need to step up, for example, with Japan on things like gas, but also start sending credible signals of where we're moving to in the future in parallel, and the kind of supplier that we can become in some parts of clean energy supply chains. And on food security, that already happens and can be done even sooner. So I would call that the Australian brand of economic warfare, because we don't tend to be a big user of sticks. And when we do use sticks like sanctions, it's usually about in partnership, and that's about sending signals as much as it is about imposing a small amount of economic pain on a Russian oligarch. Right. So I'm not saying it's not important, but we're a small player on those sort of financial markets in most of those cases.
Chris, your thoughts on this?
I beg your pardon. I agree completely with Helen. I think Australia's ability to be an economic warrior of any scale is limited by the size of our economy, by our location, by the fact that we are an island, which gives us particular geopolitical vulnerabilities, obviously, and strategic vulnerabilities as well. And in any deal, I beg your pardon, in any deal, it should never be cheaper to breach a deal than it is to comply with it. And so our ability actually to have strategic leverage in an open and market-based economy is quite limited as a middle power. Put it at its highest point, an island state in an area that is in a country which is reliant for our security interests on one partner and reliant for our economic future on our great strategic rival. It is a very difficult place for us to be. I will say this though, I'm sure there'll be other people on the panel who'll agree. It is not to say that Australia doesn't have a few exports where it has some leverage. Iron ore is obviously one of them. We've chosen not to use it, and that's been the right thing to do. Gas is another one of those. It is in Australia's national security interests to be part of the energy security equation in Asia. Critical minerals will increasingly take the same place in Australia's foreign posture, particularly in our region, as gas matures and falls away over time. So these are very, very important things. Merely putting forward or allowing your interests to be felt and heard in a region, particularly in an open and transparent way, cannot be considered economic warfare. That is a country acting in its own interests within a framework that hopefully facilitates cooperation and investment. That's very, very important. The problem we have in our region, and I see it routinely, both in Australia and in my work overseas, acting for some of our neighbours, their governments overseas, is that our strategic rivals don't do it the same way, right? And so we need to be more flexible and nuanced and joined up in the way that we do that, and I was talking about that earlier. But I'm not sure we get to say that we're an economic warrior. We have had the benefit of being under the wings of one or other of the great superpowers of the time since European settlement or colonisation here in Australia. That may be about to change, at least it may be a more contested environment over time. How we react to that, who knows? But I don't think we're going to be an economic warrior. I don't think we get to set the terms, because every time we set the term on something that we produce, the very few things that we have any influence with, we actually create two problems. One, it may be cheaper for them to breach than comply. They may go somewhere else, in which case we lose all leverage. Or two, it backfires on us because actually it does us harm, more harm than good.
Thanks very much, Chris. Look, conscious of the time and that we stand between people on lunch, then followed by a keynote speech by Minister O'Neill, I just wanted to put one quick round robin question to the panel to wrap this up here, because we've had lots of different things put on the table. And Ben, I'm going to steal your question, mate, here and say, if for everyone on the panel, if you had one thing, in all of this stuff, and we've seen a lot of the linkages come out here, that you'd be able to recommend as a first step towards building out the playbook, what would it be? Quickly in 30 seconds so we can be done in 3 minutes' time. Helen, you're sitting next to me, so you're going to have to go first. Everyone else has a bit more time to think about it, but what would you go with? What would you lead with?
Thanks, Jeff. Sorry, I'll have to steal your microphone there. I think we need a pretty comprehensive data and analysis capability, because that will help us actually understand, what the economic security issues are and help us balance the economic part of it and the security part of it now and in the future.
We need to be more joined up. We need to have, as I said earlier, an organic relationship between business, our universities, and our government that we currently don't have, and which our strategic rival has organically.
Tania.
We're about to see an Australia-made budget. In that budget, we need to have a comprehensive plan that brings together a few things. Looking at the opportunities that sit outside our own country, how do we link with the IRA in the US? How do we link with European Union? How do we link with the ASEAN, AUKUS, JAUKUS, for that matter? We need supply chain security with key strategic partners. We need to make sure that we're streamlining administration across government. That got picked up this morning. And we need to make sure that we are reducing our regulatory burden across all of the business areas that we have in order for us to be competitive, in order for us to maintain our national security.
Darren.
We have always had a commitment to the rules-based order in our foreign policy as a core pillar. So we should stick with that commitment and draft new exceptions for national security and for climate change. We might get ignored, but someone should write something down as a basis of beginning maybe a decades-long conversation for reforming the current order.
It's always hard being last, isn't it? I guess my perspective is, we recognise that the world is a lot more complex and will continue to be so. There will be shifts in power and balance, but I think as a country, we just need to be really agile, and we need to make decisions really quickly around what we want to do, where we want to play, where our strengths are, how we're going to leverage them, how we're going to manage the multitude of relationships and strategic partnerships that we're putting in place.
Thanks very much, everyone. And look, thanks also to you as the audience. This has been a really fascinating panel for me. It's something, for those of you who know me, I've been working on for much of my career. And so it's a real personal pleasure to be able to chair such a panel of such esteemed and expert voices. We would be breaking for lunch, and I think our hosts will just give you some instruction for that. But just before we do, could you please all join with me and in thanking the panel for such an invigorating discussion this morning. Thanks.